Awesome. So thank you very much for hosting me, and thank you all for being here. I'll just give you a quick sense of who I am. So I think I'm up to five titles. It's getting kind of obnoxiously long at this point. But as you can see on the screen, I'm a research affiliate at the Unconventional Weapons and Technology Division at START, at the University of Maryland. I'm a policy fellow at Charter School of Policy and Government, George Mason University. My personal favorite is an officially proclaimed U.S. Army mad scientist. I'm also the Master Coordination Director for Project Exodus Relief, helping evacuate high-risk Afghan refugees. And I'm also a senior consultant at ABS Group. Now, today I'm going to be talking about a concept I developed a handful of years ago, but I think it's an interesting one about essentially building a counter drone network, essentially nationwide distributed network of counter drone systems to better enable response to drone events, and as well as create flexibility given that we know that the nature of these threats are going to be changing over time. So I think the most significant example we've seen in the past few years of drone attacks, as you all are probably very well familiar with, is the Gatwick Airport incident just a couple of years ago, in 2018, where two drones showed up at the airport. It was unclear who exactly was controlling them and what was going on, but they shut down the airport for approximately about a day or two, shutting down literally thousands of flights, causing large amounts of damage in terms of lost cost and value. But was particularly notable is that even to this day, even a couple of years later, no one actually knows who caused them, who actually was responsible for this. There were some suspicions, but as far as I'm aware, none of the UK law enforcement have actually identified a perpetrator. And that illustrates a couple of the really big challenges here when it comes with drone response, and why I think a counter drone network is good. Namely that in these particular cases, we don't necessarily have response on the ground to do things very quickly. And there are some legal impediments that create extra challenge on top of that. But it's simply also just the nature of these attacks, where they happen very rapidly. At first, they may even seem innocuous, where this isn't actually a threat. And then we come to realize, oh, yeah, this is actually pretty significant. And having that rapid response and flexibility is going to be a big challenge. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the overall argument is that the United States and other global governments should consider creating a national network, or national networks, I suppose, plural, of anti-drone systems installed particularly at critical infrastructure sites, but potentially all around the nation, to deal with particularly high-risk threats. Now, these systems should probably need to be remotely or autonomously operated. Basically, the idea is that throughout the country you have a bunch of perhaps simply like drones in a box, as it were, like a single contained counter drone system that can help sort of watch the skies and respond immediately when a threat actually comes. Because one of the big challenges we get when it comes to response is that when the critical infrastructure owner slash operator sees, oh, all right, there's a drone coming after us. All right, so first of all, who do I call here? How long is it going to take for them to actually come here? And then by the time they come here and figure out, okay, this is a drone attack and I have to do something about it, they're going to have to, pull out their counter drone system, figure out where it's coming from, and deal with it. And throughout that entire time process, it's going to take a really long time. But if you have something remotely or autonomously operated, that might, really accelerate how things are going to go. So to give you a sense here, I'm going to first of all argue that these drone threats are growing, basically just to establish that, hey, this is worth caring about. And particularly, we should worry, and as I'll talk about critical infrastructure risks. I think there are some pretty serious ones there, and some historical examples we have already that are quite significant. Now, I'll next argue that response can be a pretty tough challenge, just simply because of the nature of these threats. And therefore, I'll develop out how this counter drone network concept might work. What's the benefits? What's the core idea? That sort of thing. And then look at what are the specific requirements, and then give a very hopefully concrete path forward in terms of how you actually develop and nurture this type of concept. So first of all, as we know, drone threats, and I'm sure you all have heard at this conference, are growing significantly. We've seen greater and greater adoption of terrorist groups using drones. So the first use, to my knowledge, is Aum Shinrikyo. They explored using drones in 1994 to deliver chemical and biological weapons agents. I'm not aware that they succeeded or ended up making a particularly serious effort, but they clearly had some interest in that. What's interesting is that in the early 90s and then early aughts or early 2000s, relatively few organizations, terrorist organizations, I should say, adopted drones. There were a few handful of one-offs, but there were, entire years where there were zero drone incidents whatsoever. But we've seen that rapidly change in just the past decade or so. ISIS, in particular, has been an incredibly prolific adopter of drones. So the statistic I reference, like in every single talk that I give, is that ISIS, during the Battle of Mosul, they launched something in the neighborhood of like 100 armed drone attacks, including like 300 total general uses of drones. So they really like embraced this technology, and we've seen greater adoption just generally. Folks like the Houthi rebels have used not only aerial drones, but they've used, for example, remotely controlled like drone boats, where they would like drive a robotic boat into a Saudi Arabian freighter or something of that sort. So we've seen this general trend upwards. And I think that trend is likely undoubtedly to expand, particularly as we get much more availability of commercial drones, in which, right now I can go down to Walmart or Best Buy and I can pick up a simple drone for like $100. It's going to have relatively low payload. It's probably not going to have something fancy like waypoint navigation or any particularly advanced like swarming concepts or advanced autonomy, something like that. But I can get a drone pretty easily. And what that means is that we can expect greater and greater adaptation. Now, there are some limits there in terms of terrorists generally tend to be fairly risk adverse, so they're not super excited to just like, all of a sudden adopt this brand new technology in incredible mass. But nonetheless, we see that trend going that way. So as we can see over time, I think we should reasonably expect, to the degree that we continually have terrorists engaged in offensive actions, we should expect to see some greater increase of drone usage. So that's a potential problem. And particularly, that's a problem because of the threats to critical infrastructure. Now, I think drones, and when I say drones, I'm mainly here referring to UAV. In practice, sorry, there's a very strange shouting outside of my door. That was very, very odd. But so in practice, when I say drones, I'm mostly referring to UAV, but terrorists over time might also increasingly adopt, sort of as I mentioned, drone boats, unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned submarine vehicles, and those are worth thinking about as well. But here I'm mostly focused on the aerial ones. So basically, UAVs, and I should say I tend to speak fairly fast. So on the off chance that someone, if I'm speaking too quickly, please let me know if I need to clarify anything in the comments. That's perfectly fine. So when we were talking about aerial drones, there are some pretty significant advantages that terrorists get. One of the big ones here is skipping over ground-based defenses. So I live in Washington, D.C., or the Washington, D.C. area, I should say. And basically everywhere around here, you can always notice where the government buildings are because they have these gigantic concrete bollards everywhere. The idea is they're very concerned about like vehicle-borne IEDs, where terrorists would just like take a car, strap a bomb to it, bring it up to the building, blow it up, and then kill a bunch of people. The challenge that we talk about in aerial drone, that's no longer relevant. A military base might have a whole bunch of really fancy fencing designed to make it really hard to climb with like some barbed wire and all that sort of thing. But if you have a drone, you just fly over it and it's no big deal whatsoever. So that can be a pretty significant challenge. Likewise, there's a pretty big challenge in terms of like overwhelming existing defenses. The idea here is that many of these critical infrastructure owners and operators are not necessarily prepared to deal with a large number of drones. Even if they have a couple counter drone systems, in theory, the terrorists can throw more and more and more and more drones until they're basically wiped out, until they no longer have the capacity to actually deal with all of that coming. Now, of course, that assumes that the terrorist organization has all of those things, but nonetheless, it's theoretically possible. And depending on the target, even getting one or two drones through can actually be pretty significant. Even if you knock down 19 or 20, if you have a single drone that, say, hits a chemical vat at a chemical facility that causes a mass release of some particularly noxious toxin, that's a huge victory for the terrorist organization, even if it doesn't even kill anyone, because that, the amount of public attention that would get would be huge. Likewise, if you're talking about, say, attacks on very important personnel from world leaders to, say, CEOs of these critical infrastructure companies or other types of, particularly high-risk folks, even, again, only having a couple drones actually get through and destroy things can be extremely significant. If you imagine what it'd be like for a terrorist to kill a world leader, that would be extremely extensive for their broader, for advancing their ideology and getting broader attention to what exactly they're trying to do. And in a few cases, precise attacks can cause some pretty significant harm, even when they were talking about like a handful of drones. So as I mentioned, I'm particularly concerned about chemical vats. And particular attacks on chemical security generally. Particularly because I think back the case of Bhopal, India, back in I think it was 1984, in which the particular chemical in company in question had a whole bunch of lax like safety security standards. They had a whole bunch of problems, so it wasn't really like a monocausal type thing. But basically, there was an accidental chemical release of I can't remember the chemical off the top of my head, but basically, it caused really major damage to that area. I think in the neighborhood of like 16,000 deaths, like huge amounts of casualties. So if like a terrorist can achieve that with a small amount of explosive to cause a mass release of a chemical agent, that can cause incredibly huge damage. And of course, there are other examples like that where you can have widespread effects. So we know in I think it was 2019. I'm forgetting the exact year, but in the Saudi attacks on the oil infrastructure and the oil refineries there, a small number of drones, coupled with, I believe, some cruise missiles, created massive disruptions in the global oil supply and destroying quite a few oil refineries. I think it was like something like 5% of global oil was reduced. It was like ridiculously high, billions of dollars of damage, huge amounts. And we can certainly imagine many other similar examples, like what, for example, if you have drones that attack a ammunition dump or other type of places where there are hazardous material, where they would cause, chain explosions or just broader release of chemicals, hazardous agents, explosive, any type of thing, of just any sort of hazard agent. So you can see that there's potentially some very significant things that come about it. Now, the challenge here is that response can often be incredibly challenging. So, first, at a basic level, drone attacks can be highly rapid. As probably many of you know, drones can fly incredibly fast. They can go upwards of 100 miles per hour. I heard a story the other day where a drone literally outran a Customs and Border Patrol helicopter. Like the helicopter had to stop for gas because the drone was flying too far. If you imagine that happening in like an actual threat context, how quickly is someone going to react? If a drone is flying at your facility at 100 miles per hour, like you have to, number one, decide, okay, this is a threat. And if it's flying at 100 miles per hour directly at you, it's probably a threat. But you at least need to understand, recognize, process what's happening, which may include, looking at your sensor systems and figuring out what's going on. You then need to decide, okay, this drone is flying at 100 miles per hour. What the hell do I do about that? Who do I call? Do I call the police? Do I call the FBI? Do I call Homeland Security? Who exactly do I do about that? And even if you immediately know that, whoever they call is going to have to provide that support, is then going to have to sort of come to that location, bringing that counter drone system to sort of recognize and stop it. But if we're talking about 100 miles per hour, however fast that cop car is driving, I'm certain it's not going 100 plus miles per hour or whatever the appropriate equivalent is in kilometers. So that's going to be a pretty major challenge in terms of responding to like a real aggressive, serious attack. And in the United States, this is compounded by some, at least, and probably some other countries as well, but I just don't know their laws well enough to say for sure. But in which, at least in the United States, only federal agencies can operate counter drone systems. Federal Bureau of Investigations, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and I think their Department of Defense. I think a couple others are allowed, but only them, which means these private sector owner operators cannot actually use the counter drone systems, which means they have to rely on those folks coming to their aid as fast as they can and just hoping that the cop car driving down the street with his sirens blaring is going to get to the facility before that drone flying at 100 miles per hour hits whatever its target, which is pretty tough to imagine here. And of course, that assumes that they even know what to do about it in the first place. Because this is a very novel threat, they simply not know how to react. And that's especially a problem because, as we know, plenty of hobbyists and other actors may be very interested in drones without actually posing a hostile threat. So one of my favorite examples of this in Louisiana, I believe it was, there was a chemical facility where a drone showed up like wandering around, and they were really suspicious. They didn't know what was happening, and they ended up calling the cops. But it was never clear what the actual intention was. In this particular case, the fellow who was controlling the drone was apparently operating it from like the middle of some like swampland. And so he was able to like drive away before the cops ever actually showed up to do anything about it. And the point being here is like, okay, what are the obvious questions? Like, is this actually like what's the cause of this? Is this some weird hobbyist who just thinks drones are cool and for whatever reason wants to take photographs of chemical security, and maybe he just got really spooked when the cops came, but he was actually doing something entirely legitimate? Because like we know there are very strong and significant hobbyist groups that work in drones, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But so what is that? Like, what do they do about it? Like in other cases, there have been drones that have showed up around like federal government buildings and they didn't know what to do about it. Like it was just floating there. Like, so they're okay. What do we have? What do we do about this? What happens if that drone like sits there for a while and then just shoots at like 100 miles per hour, rapidly accelerating at the actual facility? Who do they respond? What do they do? It's a pretty open question. So that creates just a big picture challenge in sort of how we identify and respond to these types of incidents. Now, this is where the counter drone network concept comes in. The idea here is that what nations would do is deploy some remotely operated or autonomous ground control systems to critical infrastructure. Basically, you would have capabilities stationed at the actual site, the chemical facility, the oil refinery, the federal facility, the ports, whatever it is, whatever is particularly high risk within that particular nation, to provide a much more rapid response. Now, this may seem a little bit almost sci-fi, where you sort of have, fighting drones using autonomous systems, but it's not actually at all. So there's been a couple contracts the Department of Defense has issued, the U.S. Department of Defense, I should say, to help create actual autonomous counter drone systems. They're fairly expensive, at least these particular contracts, in the neighborhood of like multi-million dollars, I think, to Anduril, and there was another one I can't remember the name of. But in theory, it's not all that difficult, because you essentially all you're really doing is hooking up a basic machine learning based machine vision system to a particular counter drone system so that it can detect and process like, oh, hey, that's a drone versus a bird. That's a hostile drone. I should, go engage it. And in theory, it actually doesn't need to be expensive at all. So I've been engaging with some folks at the University of Berkeley who believe that in theory, they can drive these prices down to only a few $100s to do do fully autonomous counter drone systems. I'm a little skeptical, and I'd want to see, the proof to show that that's definitely confident. But in theory, it seems very plausible that you just hook up a machine vision system, which are simple enough that you can find systems that do that just online, or that's sophisticated enough that undergraduate computer science students can do that type of work, and then equip it to the counter drone system, which is slightly more complicated because you have to then account for all of the various behaviors of the incoming drone to make sure you can properly intercept and do whatever is needed to neutralize it. But even without greater levels of autonomy, there's also the option of remote, like just simply remote operation. And we're increasingly see that within autonomous systems generally. As I believe within like autonomous cars, for example, there still remains some possibility of remote operation. And certainly drones, in theory, like, all the drones that we work with are remotely operated, where you have someone far away that's providing controls to say, hey, go here, go do this, that sort of thing. Now, the idea here is that if you actually have these counter drone systems like adopted, like sitting at the facility, ready to go, they can then far more rapidly, react to attacks. Because if you have something that like recognizes, hey, there's a drone coming and responds to it immediately, you then don't really have to wait too much until like waiting for that cop to sort of drive down the street or, make that call or do whatever and figure out whatever he needs to do. They're on site, they're ready to go, they can respond and neutralize as much as possible. There's also potential very real benefits in information collecting. So one of the things I probably should have expanded more upon when it comes to the advantages for terrorists with drones is that they can choose the time and place in the attack. Sort of like I mentioned with the chemical facility, in which the fellow launched a drone out from like basically a swampland off like a boat. You can imagine terrorists doing much the same, launching it off the back of a pickup truck, for example, and then, running away as soon as the drone is launched, or even before then. I guess not really before then, but running away as soon as launched or before it even hits the actual target and trying to escape. But if you have that sort of remote operated system online, say a remotely operated counter drone that will fly out, that maybe has a mixture of both cameras and nets or whatever interceptor is most appropriate, that could potentially collect information directly on the ground about the attack. And particularly, I think what's important here is identifying who is actually flying that drone, because that's one of the huge challenges, I think, here, where if you're your terrorist adversary is flying the drone from, I don't know, 100 feet, 200, 300, 500, wherever it is, it's going to be really hard to intercept that. Even if that cop, shows up there and manages to knock down the drone, by the time they've done that, that terrorist, that adversary, they're gone. They've been gone for a very long time. But if you have that native information collection, like on the scene, you can potentially create some very significant intelligence, collect some very significant information for future prosecution, intelligence collection, and whatever else one might need it for. Now, this broader network in which you have like remotely operated systems deployed all throughout your country or area also offers, I think, particularly important adaptability and potential deterrence options. So the idea here is, first of all, if you have this broad spread network, then you can mix and match, and you can also move those different systems. So for example, if broader law enforcement intelligence apparatuses find that, for whatever reason, there's a heightened threat against oil refineries and, I don't know, farms or whatever, they can then take those counter drone systems and then move them to those places. And if they realize like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have expended a whole bunch of assets to protect a bunch of, farms and agricultural systems, that was a waste of time. Let's move it somewhere else. Let's move it to those chemical facilities. Let's move to those airports, stuff like that. And likewise, the issue of adaptability is also adopting for technological and tactical changes from the adversary. So one of the things that particularly worries me is the incorporation of autonomy within drones. Namely that now for about $1,000, I can go on Amazon.com and I can purchase a drone that has basic waypoint autonomy, where it follows GPS coordinates to go from point A to B to C. Now, from a terrorist standpoint, that's incredibly valuable. For one, it means that they can sort of plot out their attack before they actually launch it and say, okay, I want my drone to hit that chemical facility. Now I know the chemical vat is at these particular GPS coordinates, so I want it to fly this direction and then hit directly. And then at that time, it'll drop the bomb. And what they can do then is then launch the drone to follow that path and then run away before they've even really carried out the attack. And so they're long gone before an attack is even realized that something's actually happening. Now, the challenge there is also that when we talk about current counter drone systems, most of them rely on jammers, namely that they sever those links between the drone and the person. So if you have greater levels of autonomy, then you also no longer really need jammers because those defenses are no longer effective. And jammers correspond to something like 50% of the current counter drone market. I can't remember exactly, but it's very significant, which means most of the defenses, to the degree that terrorists adopt autonomy, will then be obsolete. The idea here is if you have a network, you can then change that out. I don't know a particular good solution yet to that autonomy problem. I think there's a couple potential from nets to counter drone, but I'm really not that excited about any of them. But nonetheless, if you have future developments that are effective at countering those particular type of systems, if you have a network, you can then mix and match and replace and say, okay, yeah, we're worried about this. Let's start, shuffling out our current systems for something new that can better respond to the current and new tactics, procedures, and that sort of thing. And there might also be deterrence benefits that come with this. Namely, as I mentioned, like one of the advantages here is reducing the risk to the terrorist. If you have that increased visibility into what's happening, that also may deter through defensive aspects, because the terrorists may come to believe that, okay, I may actually get caught in doing this. So there may be some minor level of deterrence there. I'm not sure how significant it is, but there's definitely some that may help broader effects, particularly if people start being successful at capturing and bringing to justice the actual perpetrators of these types of attacks. Likewise, I think I hit this on this already pretty well. If you have this broader network, you can then be very selective about when and where these systems are placed. Governments can start thinking through what are their systemically important critical infrastructure. What are the things that, like, if they were disrupted, that would really cause massive effects, both in terms of the broader functioning of the country, as well as just, killing lots of people and other horrific things like that. And so you can then put those counter drone systems at those locations to have maximum effect. Now, it's of course possible that terrorists will ignore them. We know that terrorists aren't fully rational. They make decisions based on all matter of criteria for themselves. And, they may target something stupid that actually doesn't really cause much damage at all. And but I think that to some extent that's okay, because as long as our fundamental structures of the nation are protected, like ultimately that's really what matters here. The reality is, as horrible as much of terrorism is, if we're only talking like a handful of people dead, like people murder each other all the time. It's horrific and it's horrible, and we absolutely should do everything we can to prevent it. But that's very, very different from creating massive disruption to the whole of society, like wiping out an energy grid or disrupting global oil markets or releasing a massive chemical plume that kills off tens of thousands of people instead of a few. So having that targeted approach, I think, could be really effective. Now, what does it take to do this? So I think there's a few things. So first of all, there's the need to actually develop those remotely operated autonomous drone systems. As I'm aware that there are multiple contracts that have been issued on this, but then they're in development. But as I understand it, it's still a very novel technology. In theory, it strikes me as not very difficult again, but it's still novel. And so there's a need to sort of develop that further. I think much of that needs to come around developing, particularly as I mentioned, machine vision systems to recognize drones and distinguish them between other types of object, whether it's like birds, other things like leaves, any other type of flying object that could be potentially mistaken for a drone in, of course, different types of situation. Because we know that adversaries won't necessarily just undertake attacks on clear sunny days. We know they may launch attacks when it's snowing, when it's windy out, when it's fall, when it's spring, any type of combination that we could possibly have. So we need that sort of adaptability to different types of things, and we need to prove that can happen. But again, in theory, I'm not entirely sure it's all that difficult to actually do. In fact, I'm aware that at least a number of counter drone companies are already working on similar types of things, particularly when it comes to detectors, looking at how do you use machine learning and artificial intelligence to improve just general drone detecting systems. So if you equip that to the actual drone itself, assuming they work well, then you more or less have this type of system. Likewise, I think there's going to be a real need to how you manage and assess this broader network, because what you're going to have is a large number of these counter drone systems spread throughout your country, which means you need a way to figure out, okay, number one, where do you send these drones? When do you send them? How many do you send? Like if you have a very high risk target, do you just send one, or do you send like 5, 10, 15, 20? I don't really know. But that's something you'll need to think through. Likewise, you'll need to think, states will need to think through, like, how do they assess this risk from drone systems? What are those high risk targets? Is it chemical facilities? Is it oil facilities? Is it that random farmer I mentioned before who, I don't know, raises sheep that are particularly critical for the wool production of some particular country? I don't know. Point being, we need to think through how exactly would do all that. And that would also include, how do you incorporate the potential information? So if we're talking about remotely operated systems, necessarily there must be someone to remotely operate them. Who are those people? What are they trained in? Where do they work and live? And as part of that, there's also a need to think through what's the potential range of operation and how effective they can be. When there's a big challenge potentially, if we talk about remote operation, that you need ultra low latency data transfer. This is a challenge that we run into autonomous systems generally, where if the drone needs to respond very quickly to, say, a 100-mile-per-hour drone coming at a target, a small second delay can create significant challenges, because it tries to shoot where it thinks the drone is and then just misses entirely because it's gone way past wherever the bullet, net, or whatever interceptor we're talking about. So that can be a pretty significant challenge. Now, there are increasing movements in that direction. So the development of, for example, 5th generation wireless communication technology, which does have very low latency, that might support that as well. But nonetheless, it's likely going to be a significant issue. Of course, when we're talking about autonomous drone systems, it's less significant because you don't necessarily need that actual remote operation. But again, conversely, it also requires a higher degree of technological sophistication with that machine vision and the ability to recognize and respond to particular events. And for all of this, there's going to necessarily need to be organizational structure to support it. You need to have hiring processes. You need to have folks with the skills to do this. You need to develop the physical facility. Like, where would these people, like, if they're remotely operating from some sort of like control station, where do those go? Do they go in like the same building? Is it, say, regionally distributed? Like in the United States, FEMA breaks our country down to, I think, about 13 or so regions. Like, do you have one counter drone region for each of them where they have their own sort of center that explores everything? I don't really know. I don't know what makes sense, because it's going to depend on a lot of these technological issues. So, for example, if your range is relatively small to have that low transfer rate, then necessarily you need folks in the field, which may even encourage things like broader delegation of authority. So, for example, instead of having a designated like counter drone office or whatever run by the Department of Homeland Security, what if it's just a local FBI field office or whatever it is that's actually running that type of thing? But someone has to run it in order for that all to work. Likewise, there's hiring practices. How do you standardize this type of technology? Who's actually responsible for doing it? There's a lot of decisions that need to actually be made to develop something like this. So it's not just about building the technology, as important as it is. You got to think about the whole infrastructure that comes around with it. So finally, I'll include with a few specific thoughts. So I think to actually move forward on this sort of idea, I think there's a few things that need to be done. So first of all, and most importantly, there's a need for further investigation around these specific requirements. Like, what is it that you really need? How many drones do you need? How many, how sophisticated do those autonomous counter drone systems need to be? How low latency do you need? What's the range in many of these systems? Because that's going to determine, how many facilities you need, how many people you need. And it's also going to determine things like, how many people you need in terms of if you can have, can you have one drone, like one operator manage like 10, 15 remotely operated counter drone systems and just have like an alert that says like, oh, hey, pay attention to this thing? Or it does need to be like one-to-one, because that's going to create significant constraints on the broader concept. Insofar as, if you have to have one person for every system, then it becomes much more costly in terms of bringing people. But if you have, say, one person can manage, say, 50 different counter drone systems, simply because, as we know, attacks are relatively rare. So in theory, it may be possible to have a single person manage a whole bunch of systems as long as they're just getting signals to operate. Then that potentially reduce the cost quite significantly, because then you don't need to have as many people like actually in the field using the counter drone systems as we have in the current status quo. Next up, I think there's obviously a need to focus on research and development of on-site counter drone systems. That is to develop that basic technology. And again, that gets at developing detectors and integrating detectors with actual counter drone systems. That includes machine learning to recognize that that's a drone, that's not a bird, that's not a leaf, that sort of thing, and really focus on that. And I think there needs to be some dedicated efforts for this. And the reality is, I think because this is a relatively novel concept, I think there needs to be dedicated requests for proposals, RFIs, other types of governmentese mechanisms to try and solicit novel developments, even if the idea itself isn't like the perfect solution where we want to this isn't the thing we're going to put in the field, but at least sort of advances the cutting edge in doing counter drone systems. I think that could be extremely successful generally. And I think finally, the most important thing, I think, is simply fully funding Department of Homeland Security counter drone systems. This is of course, more applicable to the United States, but the principle might carry over to a number of countries. Namely, there was a recent Government Accountability Office report in the United States that current counter drone funding within the Department of Homeland Security has been relatively minimal. Now, part of that I think is justifiable because there's been so many urgent priorities. We have issues of ransomware, we have COVID-19 response, we have other types of pretty major challenges. I understand that to the degree that, at least in the United States, we haven't had very many major drone attacks. In fact, I can't think of really one that's been successful. Most of them have been sort of foiled. It makes sense that drones would be a relatively low priority. But nonetheless, in order to do this, there needs to be that funding support, because I think the trend at least indicates that there's going to be more of these over the future. And they're going to expand over time, especially as these drones become increasingly available and you become increasingly available capabilities like autonomous movement and engagement, and larger things like swarming, in which you have multiple drones interacting and cooperating together, sort of take like 50 drones and turn into a single weapon, which to me is quite terrifying. So I'll close to say, I think what's clear is drone threats are increasing, and I think response creates some very unique challenges, particularly when it comes to critical infrastructure and dealing with those legal issues in which, yes, there is justification for governments to crack down on counter drone systems, because we don't want everyone running around with jammers, jamming every signal around them. We don't want them messing with GPS signals or messing with airport traffic controllers or any of the other things that are using those type of signals. But at the same time, there's also this real need to protect those critical infrastructure. And the question is, how can we square those needs? And I'm hoping that this concept of the counter drone network can at least lead to, even if it's not the solution itself, lead to new ideas to explore and defend critical infrastructure and ultimately keep each of our countries safe. Thank you. And I'll take any questions.
Awesome. That was terrific, Zach, and super interesting. I mean, as you mentioned, this is something that I think most counter US firms would aspire to, but there's a few little hurdles along the way that they'll probably have to really nail. And maybe they'll have to nail the detection network before it becomes a complete mitigation network, that sort. But I want to kick it off with the first question, which is, are drones now classified under hostile vehicle mitigation? Do they replace or just need to be in addition to things like vehicle barrier protection?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think the answer is yes, in that they are primarily alternatives to existing modes of terrorist attack, but are not necessarily a full replacement to them. I think when it comes to any terrorist group, we often think about terrorists as being somewhat irrational, partially because they have very different values than each of us. Like, I think it's tough to imagine someone like blowing themselves up in order to keep women, for example, in horrific states of being. Like, I think that's just tough, particularly for those of us in the West, to imagine. But the reality is that many of these organizations are going to be thinking critically and comparing different types of systems and like thinking about what works best for their particular goals and their purposes. And so in some cases, I think, yes, vehicle-borne IEDs and other traditional like suicide vests might make a lot more sense than a drone, particularly because, like, if we talk about vehicle-borne IEDs, they can carry vastly more poundage in terms of explosive. I think it potentially goes up to 500 to, I think, 10,000 pounds if we're talking about like one of those like really big truck type things. Whereas drones may only have like half a pound, couple pounds, something like that, pretty small. So depending on their target and their ultimate goals, it may make sense to do one versus the other, and that's going to depend on just their situation.
No, I mean, as you said, if you've got a vehicle and there's multiple layers preventing you from dropping something into a dam or a water source, those layers will protect against it, whereas the drone can just escape over those. So, no, absolutely. There's a question here that says your, I guess, concept of the counter drone network, would it involve multiple vendors with different make and model of counter drone systems and types, or should it be one specific vendor that is headlining this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really have a good answer to that. In theory, I think ultimately it like matters what effectively works better and the degree to which they are interoperable. If it turns out, and I can imagine situations in which it actually would make a lot of sense to have multiple different types of vendors, particularly if they have different types of capability that makes sense for different types of facility or targets. So, for example, if you have vendors that have really long range, have longer range, are useful against certain types of drones, not necessarily others, it may make sense to stick them in certain types of facilities than others. And actually, I also want to briefly hit on sort of the comment that you introed with that sort of, I think, gets at this as well. I think part of the challenge is there needs to be some direct R&D type support to explore these things and to support counter drone companies to sort of figure this out and to figure out what is the best approach here at a very like exploratory level, because I do think it is a big change, and I think that hits at like the challenge of different types, because we certainly know that different types of detectors, different types of interceptors, they have they have benefits and they have advantages, and depending on the facility, some of those may make sense and some of those may not.
Yeah, okay. And look, it's really interesting because over here in Australia, I know one or two, counter US firms are trying to build some, remote operating centers or, positional areas like the bunker that I think was mentioned previously, where someone's sitting in there coordinating this.
Yeah.
Now, with the US and all those different states and state laws, do you see this as a potential problem, or is that surpassed by the fact that the governing body will be DHS and so will overrule that? Is there a potential issue there, or is that something that you think will come into that research component?
That's a good question. I think some of that, yeah, will be over sort of overcome by just broader federal authority within that. I could imagine some level of states' rights issues there, depending on what the location is, and to the degree to which, like, the state gets wants to claim sovereignty. I mean, that gets into squishy constitutional issues within the United States, namely with the supremacy clause, in which federal government can sort of supersede the states in particular issues. But it was also the Amendment 9, which reserved for states, anything that's not actually given. So I think that's definitely something that might need to get worked through. But I think in theory, it's not necessarily that much of an issue, because ultimately, I think typically states, not always, but often, tend to defer to the federal government when it comes to national security issues, because that's more their lane. States, by contrast, tend to be pretty effective at, like, dealing with low level crime and stuff like that, whereas the feds tend to deal with, like, terrorism and stuff like that. So to the degree that there becomes much greater concern about drones just generally, I think there'll also be greater demand within states to support these type of systems, as well as just counter drone systems generally, even if we're not necessarily talking about these. And actually, that reminds me, I think, as I'm thinking about it, I think there would also be some level of demand among state and local law enforcement. I know that like that's been a particularly big concern when it comes to those like legal boundaries around who controls counter drone systems. Where I know of at least a couple cases where state and local governments have tried to contract out counter drone systems to various like people who just offer it, and they got their hands whacked by the federal government. It's like, you're not allowed to do that. But the challenge was, like, and sympathetically, like, the police have never dealt with this problem before, so they don't know what the rules are, and, like, you can't really expect them to just be like, they have a problem, they're there to keep people safe, they see a solution, bring these people in. So I think, if they have that direct engagement with feds on that, I think that could be a big supporting factor as well.
Okay, and I just want to dig into one side, and this question is from me because sometimes we'll see different counter drone, or let's say drone detection providers, very sensitive about sharing some of their customers' data, which is fair enough. Now, if you've got a network set up around critical infrastructure where they're sharing that kind of data, the government can access it. How privy do you think commercial organizations or private organizations might be to having their drone detection data that they were paying for, say, provided as well to the side to government? Do you think that's actually an added value, an added benefit, or it might be a bit difficult?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right that there would definitely be difficulties in sort of navigating that trust relationship there between the different parts of the organization. I'm not entirely, I confess, I'm not entirely sure understand what your question is getting at. So I apologize if I'm totally off base. But I think what it sort of speaks to is, like, certainly the need to build trust between all of these parties. Because I do think that, like, yeah, the vendors do have a legitimate reason to sort of want to protect their intellectual property and don't necessarily want that going everywhere. But it strikes me as it's not really necessarily much of a problem, because we deal with that problem within government, like, all the time. We're not necessarily particularly good at resolving it, but it's at least a problem that we've tackled, and to the degree that there are any good solutions there around. So, for example, creating pre-acquisition agreements to say, like, okay, this particular data will be shared, this won't, this is who not. But there might also, yeah, I agree, might be opportunities there to sort of share data to incorporate within, like, broader network to improve systems. Because ultimately, I think all of us are really here for the same purpose. We're here to safeguard lives from these threats, and that's really ultimately the only thing that matters. Everything else is secondary, and it matters and it's important, and there are things that we need to work through. But as long as we're focused on what's important, and there might be some broader opportunities there, say, about building collaborative opportunities between different drone companies to share data that might be mutually useful, but isn't also putting their own business at risk. Because if two companies can work together and improve both their systems, like, that's wonderful. That helps everyone. They have more effective products. Government is safer. People in the community are safer. Government gets a better buy for their money. It's just wonderful. Of course, that does require that trust building and relationship building, which is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a phenomenal idea, and it's something that might not be too far away. Given the universal traffic management or urban air mobility systems, where they want to determine friend from foe, potentially we'll start seeing those counter US merging with traffic management systems. It might only be a matter of time.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, Zach, thank you so much for your talk. There's no more questions from my side. And look, we're going to have a short break before Christopher Church comes on, but really appreciate the talk, the information you provided, and hope to see you again on the GDSN.
Likewise, thanks for having me. If anyone wants to reach out, there's my contact information. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn or follow me on Twitter. I'm happy to chat further.